There were 240 of us aboard the night the ship should have gone down, and we are all still here because a junior officer everyone had told to get out of the way refused to leave the one place on the ship that was trying to kill her. I was a deck sailor, and like most of the crew, I did not think much about the people who ran the engineering spaces below the waterline. They were the grease and the noise and the heat, the ones who kept us moving, and we topside men had a careless habit of looking down on the work and the people who did it. Among the engineering officers was a young one, quiet and serious, a woman who had come up through the hard technical trades and knew the ship's guts better than anyone aboard. The senior men did not always make it easy for her. I heard more than one of them suggest she was in over her head, that when a real casualty came, a serious one, the kind that tests a ship, she would be a liability down in those spaces, that she should leave the heavy work to men who'd been doing it longer. She did not argue. She just spent her watches learning every valve and pump and bulkhead on that ship as if her life depended on it. As it turned out, all our lives did. The casualty came in the black of night, far from any help. I never learned all the details of what struck us, whether it was a mine or something in the machinery, or simply the sea finding a weakness the way the sea always will. What I know is that there was a terrible blow deep in the ship, and then the worst combination a sailor can face, fire and flooding at once, both of them in the main engineering space, the heart of the ship. Fire to burn us and water to sink us, in the same compartment, fighting each other and both winning. The ship lost power. She began to settle, and the word that went through the passageways in the dark was the word that empties a man's stomach, that the engine room was gone, that it was flooding and burning beyond saving, that we might have to abandon ship into a black ocean, a long way from anyone who could come. Us. The senior engineers tried and were driven back. The heat and the smoke and the rising water made that space a death trap, and good men went down to fight it and came back up because no human being could stay in that. The order half formed to seal the compartment and give it up, to write off the engine room and the ship's power with it, and pray the flooding could be contained elsewhere, and sealing that compartment meant abandoning any chance of saving the ship's heart, and likely the ship. And the junior officer went the other way. While men were coming out, she went in. She did not panic and she did not throw herself away, which is the thing people misunderstand about what she did. She had spent months learning that compartment, and she went into it with a plan, knowing exactly which valves would stop the flooding and which systems could fight the fire and the order they had to be done in. She went down into the heat and the smoke and the rising water, alone, because no one else would or could, and she began, methodically, to save the ship. For 2 hours she fought it. 2 hours in a flooding, burning compartment in the dark, in heat that should have driven anyone out in minutes, working by feel and by memory through smoke too thick to see in. She isolated the flooding, valve by valve, wading in water that climbed past her waist, finding the cut-off she had memorized when no one thought it mattered. She fought the fire back from the systems that could not be allowed to burn. She jury-rigged and braced and patched, one impossible problem after another, and every time the rest of us up top were certain the ship was lost, the settling would slow, or the smoke would thin, and we would understand that someone was still down there, still fighting, still winning inches back from the sea. A petty officer who tried to follow her down to help, and could not stay more than a few minutes in that heat, told me afterward about the one glimpse he got of her at work, and it has stayed with me ever since. He said she was braced against a bulkhead in water to her chest, the fire's glow on one side of her and the dark flood rising on the other, working a stubborn valve by feel because the smoke had blinded her, and that she was talking to herself in a low, steady voice, not in fear but in sequence, naming each step before she did it, the way she must have rehearsed it 100 times in her head on quiet watches. He said she never once looked panicked, never once looked like someone who thought she might die down there, only like someone with a list of correct things to do and the discipline to do them in order. He came back up because his body made him. She stayed because her mind would not let the ship go. She stopped the flooding. She killed the fire. She brought power back to a ship that had been dying, alone, in 2 hours, in a compartment that had driven back every man who tried it. And when she finally came up out of that space, scorched, soaked, barely able to stand, her uniform burned and her hands raw, the ship was alive under our feet again, riding steady, saved. 240 of us who had been minutes from a black ocean were still aboard a living ship because of what one junior officer had done below The waterline in the dark. I was on deck when they brought her up. I watched the senior engineers, the same men who had said she was in over her head, gather around her, and I watched them understand, all at once, what she had just done and what it meant. One of them, a chief who had spent 30 years in those spaces, took off his own cover and stood bareheaded in front of her, and then the others did the same, and word spread up through the ship until the whole crew knew, and from that night on there was not a sailor aboard who would hear a word against her. I learned afterward, what the doubters had never bothered to see, that she had not been in over her head at all, that she was simply one of the finest engineers ever to serve aboard that ship, that the quiet study they had mistaken for uncertainty was the most thorough mastery of the ship's systems anyone could remember. She had let them doubt her because the work mattered more than the argument. The casualty, she had always known, would settle it, and it had in 2 hours in the dark below the waterline. The captain honoured her before the whole crew, but the honour, I remember, was the chief standing bareheaded on the deck, because that man knew exactly what she had done and exactly how impossible it had been, and his respect was the kind you cannot fake or order. He had told her once to leave the heavy work to the men. He spent the rest of the cruise telling every young sailor who'd listened that the best engineer he had ever served with was the junior officer he doubted, and that he'd been a fool, and that the sea had taught him so. I asked her once, when the cruise was nearly over and I had finally worked up the nerve to speak to her, whether she'd had been afraid down there. She looked at me with that quiet steadiness and said of course she had, that anyone who wasn't afraid in a flooding engine room was a fool, but that fear and surrender were two different things, and the trick was to let yourself feel the first without ever signing up for the second. She said she had decided long before that night that she would not be the engineer who knew how to save a ship and was too frightened to try, and that the rest was just doing the work she'd trained for, one valve at a time, until it was done. I have repeated that to more frightened young sailors than I can count. I have never again looked down on the people who run the spaces below. I tell young sailors about the night the engine room flooded and burned, and a junior officer everyone had told to get out of the way went down into it alone and saved us all. And I tell them the thing she taught a careless deck sailor without a single word of reproach, that the most important person aboard is not always the loudest or the most senior, that the quiet one studying the valves when no one thinks it matters may be the only soul aboard who can save the ship when the worst night comes, and that you had best learn to respect her before the sea makes you.